The town was called Coldwater Springs, but the name was a kindness. The water in the trough outside the Overland Hotel was solid ice, and the springs up the mountain had been frozen since October. It was the deep breath of winter in 1880 Montana, the kind of cold that got in a man's bones and stayed there. For Willa Morgan, it felt like a judgment. She sat in the common room of the hotel, which was really just a drafty plank building with a bar, a stove, and 6 small rooms upstairs. She had been sitting in the same chair for 3 days, trying to look as if she belonged. She did not. Her wool coat was from Boston, finely made but not meant for a land that hated weakness. Her hands, long-fingered and pale, were chapped red under the cuffs. They were pianist's hands, hands that knew ivory and velvet, now tucked into her lap to hide their trembling. She was down to her last $1.40, tucked into a small reticule that felt heavy with its own emptiness. She was hungry. The common room smelled of stale beer, wet wool, and the thick venison stew simmering in the kitchen. The smell was a constant, low-level torture. She had eaten nothing but a cold biscuit yesterday, and the day before, nothing at all. This was not how it was supposed to be. She was Willa Morgan, daughter of Silas Morgan, a man who had once owned half a street in Boston. She had played Chopin at salons where women wore French silk, and then, in the space of a single month, the fortune had vanished, and her father had taken a pistol to his study. The shame was worse than the cold. She had sold her jewelry, her sheet music, her mother's pearls. She had bought a stagecoach ticket as far west as the money would take her, clinging to a vague, foolish idea of starting over, perhaps as a governess or a music teacher. But the coach had hit a blizzard, the axle had broken, and she had been stranded here, in Coldwater Springs, for a week. The whispers had started on the second day. She saw them, the 2 women huddled by the stove, Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, and the younger woman who worked at the mercantile. They were knitting, their needles clicking like insects, their voices a low drone she could almost feel. "That's her," from the east, put on airs when she arrived. They said, "Well, the airs are gone now. Hesh, the innkeeper, says she hasn't paid for her room since Tuesday. Heard she was ruined, back in Boston. That's why she fled." "Ruined?" The word was sharp, excited. "You know, damaged goods. They say her father found out and—" Mrs. Gable made a small, sharp motion toward her own temple. Willa closed her eyes. The heat from the stove could not reach her. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin tight and cold. She was a spectacle, a piece of gossip, a ruined woman. The words settled on her like the frost on the window pane, blurring her from the inside out. The door to the common room opened, and the world went silent for a moment, replaced by the roar of the wind. A blast of Arctic air swept the floor, carrying fine, sharp snow with it. A man stepped inside. He did not shut the door so much as let it fall closed against his back. He was tall, but lean, built of whipcord and silence. He wore a canvas coat worn to the color of dust, stained dark at the shoulders from melted snow. A battered hat was pulled low, but she could see the hard line of his jaw, stubbled with graying beard. He moved to the bar, and the snow on his boots left dark, wet prints on the floor. He did not look at anyone. He pulled off his gloves, slapping them against his thigh, and the sound was like a gunshot in the room. "Hesh," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel rolling downhill. The innkeeper, a heavy man named Hesh, nodded. "Mr. Travers, nasty one out there." "It'll get worse," the man, Travers, said. It was not a prediction, but a fact. He pushed a small, damp list across the bar. "Need this, and coffee, black." This was Eli Travers. Willa had heard the name, a rancher. Some said a recluse, lived up on the mountain, miles from anyone. They said he was a widower, but they said it quietly. He was not a man who invited questions. As Hesh moved to the mercantile shelves behind the bar, Eli Travers turned. His back was to the room, but his head angled, and for a half-second, his eyes swept the common room. They were the color of the sky before the snow, a flat, hard gray. They passed the card players, the whispering women, and then they landed on Willa. It was not a look of pity, and it was not a look of interest. It was an assessment. He saw the thin coat. He saw the tremor in her hands. He saw her trying to shrink into the chair. His gaze lingered for a beat, no more, and then moved on. He had seen her, logged her as part of the room, and dismissed her. Willa looked down at her lap, her face burning with a shame so deep it felt like its own kind of cold. To be seen in her poverty was worse than the poverty itself. He turned back to the bar as Hesh began sacking flour and salt. Eli Travers drank his coffee standing up, paid in coin, and gathered his supplies. He did not look her way again. He hauled the heavy sacks to the door, braced himself, and walked back out into the white world. The door banged shut, and the room seemed to settle. The whispers started up again, louder this time. Willa stayed in her chair until the light outside began to fail, a weak gray washing of the sky that promised a long, bitter night. The common room began to fill. Men from the logging camp came in, stamping snow from their boots, their laughter loud and raw. They drank whiskey and threw dice. She could not stay here. She could not face them. She rose, her joints stiff, and made her way up the narrow stairs to her room. It was tiny, with a sloped ceiling and a single window that was frozen opaque. The air was colder than the common room. There was a bed, a washstand with a pitcher of water, the surface of which was filmed with ice. She sat on the edge of the cot, her coat still on, and waited. She did not know what she was waiting for. A miracle, perhaps, or an end. A knock came, hard and heavy. She jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. "Yes?" The door opened without her bidding. It was Hesh, the innkeeper. He filled the doorway, his face shadowed and unhappy. "Miss Morgan," he said, not unkindly, but with the flat finality of business. "Mr. Hesh." He held a piece of paper. "Your bill, it's Friday. I told you Tuesday. You're 4 days past." "I know, she stammered, the old, useless lie rising to her lips. "I am expecting funds from Boston. The telegraph lines must be down from the storm." He sighed, a plume of fog in the cold room. "Miss, the lines ain't down, and no funds are coming. We both know it. I've got men here, paying men, who need rooms. I can't be giving charity. It's a hard winter." "Please," she whispered. The word broke her. It was the first time she had begged. Just until the weather breaks. I can work. I can clean. I can—" "Clean what?" He gestured around the tiny room. "My wife does the cleaning. I got a man for the bar. I don't need a piano player." Tears stung her eyes, hot and immediate. She blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. "Please." "I'm sorry, Miss, truly." He looked uncomfortable, but his mind was set. "You pay the bill, or you're out. Tonight." "Tonight? But—" She looked at the window, at the white ice that sealed it. The wind was howling now, a living thing outside the thin walls. "Where am I to go? I'll freeze." "That ain't my problem," he said, his voice hardening. "My problem is the $4.60 you owe me. You got it, or you go." She looked down at her hands. She had nothing but the clothes she wore and the $1.40 in her bag. She had failed. Her father's blood was in her, the blood of a failure. "I do not have it," she said, her voice dead. Hesh nodded, his face grim. "Then pack your things. I'll give you 10 minutes." He turned to leave. Willa stood up, a wild, thin panic rising in her. She would die. They were throwing her out to die. "No," she said, louder than she intended. Hesh stopped. "No, wait," she said, her mind racing. She heard the voices from the common room below. She heard the wind. 10 minutes, miss." And then, from the hallway just behind Hesh, a low voice spoke. "How much?" Hesh turned. Willa peered around him. It was the rancher, Eli Travers. He was standing at the top of the stairs, a canvas roll in one hand. He had not left town. Perhaps his mule had thrown a shoe. He looked tired, and the cold had settled on his skin, making him look carved from stone. "Mr. Travers," Hesh said, surprised. "This ain't your concern." "You said $4.60, Eli stated. It was not a question. "That's right." "For the room." "I heard you." Eli moved past Hesh, his shoulder brushing the bigger man, and stopped at Willa's door. He did not look at her. He looked past her, at the frozen window. He reached into his coat. He pulled out the same worn leather pouch. He worked his fingers into it, his knuckles raw from the cold, and drew out a small stack of coins. He counted out 4 silver dollars, then added 2 quarters and a dime. He held them out to Hesh. Hesh stared at the money, then at Eli, then at Willa. A slow, knowing look spread across the innkeeper's face. "Well, now, I didn't—" "That settles her." Eli cut him off. He pushed more coins into Hesh's hand. "That's for another week. And you'll send a plate of that stew up to this room. A hot one." "Eli, I don't know what you're—" "It's just money. Hesh, take it or don't." Hesh looked at the silver in his palm. It was more than she owed. It was security. He scooped the coins up. "As you wish, Mr. Travers. The room is hers. For 1 week." Hesh backed away, giving Eli a look that was half respect, half suspicion, and disappeared down the stairs. Willa was left alone with him. He filled the space Hesh had left, a cold, silent presence that smelled of pine and snow. She was trembling from head to toe. She did not know the rules of this land, but she knew what it looked like when a man paid for a woman's room. Her shame was so profound it was almost a sickness, rising in her throat. "Sir," she began, her voice a reedy whisper. I cannot accept this. I cannot repay you." Eli Travers finally looked at her. His eyes were clear, and they held no warmth, but also no judgment. He just looked at her, at the fine bones of her face, the terror in her eyes, the chapped lips. "I don't expect you to," he said. His voice was flat. He turned, and with 2 steps, he was gone, his boots making solid, heavy sounds on the wooden stairs. Willa sank onto the bed. She heard his steps cross the common room and the front door open and close one last time. He was gone. A few minutes later, the innkeeper's wife brought up a bowl of stew, thick with meat and potatoes, and a hunk of bread. She set it on the washstand without a word, and left. Willa ate. She ate with her fingers and the 1 spoon, hunched over the bowl like an animal, the hot food burning her throat, and for the first time since Boston, she wept. She cried into the bowl, quiet, racking sobs for her father, for her music, and for the stranger who had bought her 1 more week of life. The next morning, she woke to the sound of a mule braying. She dressed and hurried down, her heart pounding. He was there, outside the hotel, cinching the last of his supplies onto a gray mule. His horse, a sturdy-looking bay, stood patiently, its breath pluming in the air. She walked out onto the porch, pulling her thin coat tight. The cold was a physical blow. "Mr. Travers," she called. He did not stop his work, but his head turned, acknowledging her. She walked down the steps, into the snow, stopping a few feet from him. I wanted to thank you." He finished his knot, pulling it tight with a single, sharp jerk. He turned to face her. The light was better now. She could see the lines etched around his eyes from sun and wind, the silver in his beard. He was perhaps 40, perhaps older. He looked like the mountains he lived in, worn and permanent. She had rehearsed a speech, something about her honor, about finding work, about repaying him, but looking at him, the words felt foolish, like lace in a blizzard. So she just stood there, holding her coat closed, and met his eyes. She tried to pour all the gratitude, all the desperate, terrible relief she felt, into that one look. He watched her. He saw the pride struggling against the shame. He saw the resolve in her that had not quite frozen to death. He gave a single nod. Sharp, final. Then he swung himself up onto his horse, took the mule's lead rope, and rode out of town, heading north toward the mountains. He did not look back. Willa stood in the snow until he was just a dark speck against the white, and then she went back inside. The week he had bought her was a torment. The snow did not stop. It fell for 2 days straight, burying the town. And then the wind came, sculpting the drifts into high, impassable walls. Willa was a prisoner. Hesh and his wife left her alone, but the whispers in the common room were brutal. Now, they were not just about her past. They were about her present. Eli Travers had paid for her. The assumption was clear. The women looked at her with open contempt, the men with a new, speculative interest. One evening, a deputy, a man with a thick neck and wet-looking eyes named Lorne, had offered to buy her a drink when she'd refused. He'd laughed and said, "Too good for me, or is Travers paying you to wait?" Her week was ending. The money was gone. The storm had broken, but the temperature had dropped further. The world outside was a bright, glittering trap. On the 7th day, Hesh found her by the stove. "Miss Morgan," he said, his voice neutral, "your week is up. Tomorrow." Willa nodded. She had known. "I understand." "What's your plan?" he asked. She looked at her hands. "I do not have one." "Well," he said, rubbing his apron. "Deputy Lorne was asking, said he might have work up at the jail. Cleaning, maybe." Willa looked at the deputy, who was at the bar, watching her. He raised his glass and smiled. It was not a kind smile. She knew, with chilling certainty, what kind of work it would be. She stood up. "Thank you, Mr. Hesh. I will be gone in the morning." She went upstairs and packed her small bag. It held almost nothing. A change of linen, a hairbrush, a single book of poetry. Before the sun rose, she left the room. She crept down the stairs, her worn leather shoes making no sound. She did not owe them anything. She slipped out the front door into the dark. The cold was shocking. It stole her breath. The snow was packed hard, frozen solid, reaching 3 feet or more up the sides of the buildings. The town was asleep. She knew the direction he had gone. North. She began to walk. She had no map, no compass, only the vague tracks, almost invisible, that led out of town and up into the foothills. She was a city woman. She did not know the wilderness. She only knew that the jail was behind her, and something else, something unknown, was ahead. The first hour was misery. The packed snow on the road was slick, and she fell twice, bruising her hip. But the road soon vanished, turning into a simple trail marked by the passage of Eli's horse and mule. By noon, the sun was a weak glare in the sky, offering no warmth. Her shoes, good Boston leather, were soaked through and freezing solid. Her toes had gone from aching to numb. She did not care. She kept walking. She had no food. She ate handfuls of snow, which seared her mouth and did nothing to fill the hollow ache in her stomach. The trail climbed. The wind was worse up here, a high, thin scream that cut through her coat. She pulled her shawl over her head, but the wool was too thin. By late afternoon, her shoes began to fail. The frozen leather, stiff as wood, cracked. The sole of her left shoe tore halfway off, catching on the snow, tripping her. She ripped it off in a fit of cold rage and threw it. Now she was walking with one shoe, and the other foot wrapped only in its stocking. The snow was deeper here, soft powder over a hard crust. She broke through with every step. Night came, not slowly, but like a curtain dropping. The world went from gray to black. She was terrified. She heard the cry of a wolf, far off, and she began to sob. Stumbling forward, she could not stop. To stop was to die. She fell, and she lay in the snow, the cold seeping into her, and it felt warm. It felt like sleep, a dangerous, soft peace. No. She thought of Deputy Lorne's wet smile. She thought of Mrs. Gable's whispers. She got up. Her other shoe was gone. She did not remember losing it. Her feet were just 2 blocks of pain. She tore strips from her petticoat, her fingers so numb she could barely work the fabric, and wrapped them around her feet. They were soaked and frozen in minutes. She walked all night. She walked into a gray, hopeless dawn. She was delirious. She saw her father's study. She heard a piano playing. The trees looked like men in dark coats, watching her. She was following something, a line of smoke. She stumbled out of the trees into a clearing. There was a small, solid cabin, built of dark logs, with a low-pitched roof. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, a thin, straight line against the gray sky. At the edge of the clearing, a man was chopping wood. The thwack of his axe was the only sound. He stopped, the axe halfway through its swing. He stood still, watching her. It was him, Travers. Willa tried to call out. No sound came. She took one step toward the cabin, toward the smoke. She reached out her hand. She collapsed at the property line, her body falling beside a rough-hewn fence post. She did not lose consciousness. She simply stopped. She had no more strength. She lay in the snow and watched him. Eli Travers stood frozen for a full 10 seconds. He saw the shape in the snow, the tangle of dark skirts, the pale hand. He thought it was an animal, then a ghost. Then he recognized the coat. Fool, he breathed. The word was ripped from him. He dropped the axe and ran. He did not run like a man in a hurry. He ran like a man trying to outrun a bullet. He reached her in seconds, sinking to his knees in the drift. Her face was a waxy, bluish white. Her lips were cracked and dark. Ice was frozen in her eyelashes. He grabbed her arm. It was stiff. He looked down at her feet. He saw the bloody, frozen rags of her petticoat. Barefoot, he said, his voice rough with disbelief. God Almighty! He slid his arms under her, one beneath her knees, one behind her back. He lifted her. She weighed nothing, a bundle of wet wool and ice. She stirred, her head falling against his chest. She made a small sound, a sigh. He carried her toward the cabin, his boots punching deep into the snow. He was angry. He was angry at the town, angry at the cold, and angry at this woman for bringing her trouble to his door. He kicked the cabin door open. The heat from the stove rushed out to meet them. It was a single room, clean, sparse, and warm. A fire burned in the stone hearth. A bed was in one corner, a cot in the other. He strode to the cot and laid her down, not gently. She shivered, a violent bone-rattling tremor that shook the small bed. "Don't go," she whispered, her eyes closed. "Please, it's so cold." Eli looked at her. He looked at the raw, frozen flesh of her feet. He looked at the ice on her face. He turned to the door and shoved it closed, the heavy bar thudding into place. Outside, the wind picked up. It was a low moan at first, then a rising shriek. The first hard pellets of a new storm began to rattle against the single glass window. Eli looked at the window, then at the woman on his cot. He knew that sound. That was not a storm. That was a siege. They were trapped. The cabin was one room, but it was not small. It was solid, built of thick, dark logs chinked so tightly not a breath of wind came through. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. A black pot-bellied stove stood near the back for cooking, and a heavy plank table sat in the middle. His bed, a wide frame with a thick mattress, occupied one corner. The cot he had laid her on was in the other. Life in that room was measured in silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind outside, and the shifting of Eli's weight in his chair. He had saved her feet. He had cut the frozen rags away with his skinning knife, his touch surprisingly steady. He had packed them in snow first, a thing that had seemed monstrously cruel to her. But he'd said it was the only way. Then he'd worked melted tallow and herbs into the raw, split skin. He had wrapped them in clean linen, his big, calloused hands moving with an odd, impersonal precision. He had not spoken a word through the entire process, save to tell her, "This will hurt." She had bitten her lip until it bled, but she had not cried out. Now, she was a prisoner of the cot, and of her own shame. Eli Travers was a man who took up space without moving. He sat at the table, oiling a rifle, or stood by the window, staring out at the white, endless drifts. He was a man of few words, and those he used were necessary. No more. "Stew's hot. More wood. It'll snow 3 more days." Willa felt like a stray dog he had taken in, a burden he was too decent to cast out, but a burden all the same. She was mortified by her reliance on him. He had paid her bill. He had saved her life, and now she lay on his cot, useless, while he tended the fire that kept her from freezing and cooked the food that kept her from starving. The silence between them stretched, becoming a tangible thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the air. On the 4th day, the pain in her feet had subsided to a deep, throbbing ache. She could stand, leaning on the wall. I must help," she said. Her voice sounded strange, too thin. In the quiet room, Eli was sharpening an axe blade. The rhythmic shing, shing, shing of the whetstone stopped. He did not look up. Nothing to do but wait out the storm. He said, "I can cook," she offered, hobbling toward the stove. "If you'll show me where things are. I cannot just lie here." He looked at her then. He assessed her, the way he had at the inn. He saw the flush of shame on her high cheekbones. He grunted, a low sound in his chest. "Flour is in the bin, beans in the sack, salt on the shelf. Don't waste the bacon." It was a permission. Her world shrank to the tasks at hand. She soaked beans, kneaded dough for skillet bread, and stirred the pot of venison stew he had started. Her hands, soft and pale, were clumsy at first. She burned her wrist on the stove and hissed, but she did not complain. She was clumsy with the heavy iron, but she learned. The cabin began to smell of baking bread and coffee, and the silence changed. It was no longer empty. It was occupied. Eli watched her. He watched her limp from the dry sink to the stove, her face set in concentration. She was out of place, a fine porcelain cup in a woodshed, but she did not break. In the afternoon, while the snow fell in a thick, dizzying curtain outside, her eyes landed on the object in the darkest corner of the cabin. It was a piano, not a grand, but an upright, its wood dark and scarred. It was covered in a canvas tarp and stacked with traps and boxes. She looked at it, her hands stopping their work of dicing onions. "Don't," Eli said. He had not looked up from his work, but he knew. "It's yours?" "My mother's," he said. The words were clipped. "It's broke. Strings are rusted. Hasn't been played in 10 years. Willa moved toward it, her bandaged feet shuffling. She touched the canvas. "May I?" He sighed, a long breath of irritation, and waved his hand. She pulled the tarp off. Dust motes danced in the firelight. She lifted the heavy wooden key cover. The keys were yellowed, and 2 of them were chipped. She pressed one, gently. A sound emerged, dull, flat, and sour. It was terribly out of tune. Willa sat on the stool, which was solid, but one leg was wobbly. Her hands, which had been clumsy with the skillet, found their place. They hovered over the keys, and, for a moment, she was not a ruined woman in a drafty cabin. She was in Boston. She was in a warm salon, the scent of wax and perfume in the air. She pressed the keys, her fingers moving slowly, finding a simple chord, then another. She picked out a melody, a simple folk tune he might know, compensating for the dead strings, her touch light, coaxing the broken thing into a semblance of music. The song was quiet, fractured, but it was music. Eli had frozen. His hands, holding a piece of leather harness, were still. He was watching her back. He watched the way she held her head, the straightness of her spine. He remembered his mother, a small, stern woman, sitting the same way. He had not heard that sound in this room since the day they buried her. He felt a tightness in his chest, a sudden, sharp ache he did not recognize. It was unwelcome. Willa finished the tune, her hands resting. The last sour note hung in the air. "You play," he said. It was not a question. "I did," she said, her voice soft. She looked at her hands, chapped and red. One blistered from the pot. "It seems a long time ago." She got up and went back to the stew. But something had shifted. The piano, broken as it was, had given her a piece of herself back. The small gestures began. A silent language spoken between two people who did not trust words. He would go out in the white fury of the storm to check his stock in the small barn, and he would return with his beard caked in ice. He would stand by the fire, dripping, and she would have a hot cup of black coffee waiting for him on the table. He would take it, his gaze flickering to her face for just a second, and nod. She found his mending basket. His shirts were torn at the elbows, his socks worn through. She sat by the fire, her feet propped on a stool, and she stitched. Her stitches were fine, almost invisible, the work of a lady taught needlepoint. She mended the rip in his canvas coat, her fingers aching from pulling the thick thread through the stiff material. He found the coat, mended, hanging by the door. He ran his thumb over the seam. It was stronger than it had been before. That night, he went out and came back with a double armload of firewood, far more than was needed. He stacked it neatly by the hearth and said nothing, but she knew it was for her, so she would not be cold while he slept in his bed and she on the cot. They did not talk of their pasts. They did not talk of the future. They spoke of the weather, the dwindling flour, the behavior of the horse in the barn. But their ghosts were there, living in the cabin with them. Willa's came at night. She would wake with a gasp, her heart hammering, the smell of cigar smoke and brandy in her nostrils. She was back in Boston, in her father's study. She saw the dark shape on the floor. She saw the pistol. Or worse, she would dream of Mr. Abernathy, the man who had bought her father's debts, the man who had smiled at her, his eyes cold, and said, "Your father left quite a mess, my dear, but you are a lovely asset." She dreamed of the whispers. Ruined, damaged goods, sold. She cried out, a small, choked sound. She woke. The cabin was dark, the fire banked to glowing embers. Across the room, she heard a sound. Eli was sitting up in his bed, a dark shape against the faint light from the snow-covered window. He was watching her. "Bad dream," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Go to sleep," he said, his voice rough. But he did not lie down. He sat there, awake, for a long time, listening to the sound of her unsteady breathing. He was guarding her, not from the storm, but from the phantoms in the room. His own ghosts were quieter, but they were meaner. He would sit, staring into the fire, and he would see a rope. He would see his sister, Mary. She was 19. She had been pretty, and she had laughed too much. They said she stole a locket from the mercantile. The deputy, a younger, meaner version of Lorne, had said so. The judge had said so. Eli knew she had not. He knew the deputy had wanted her, and she had refused him. The town had gathered. They had watched. He had tried to stop it. He had come in with a rifle, wild with rage. But they had outnumbered him. They had put him in a cell until it was done. He had spent the next year hunting them. Not the town, but the deputy, the judge, and the man who ran the mercantile. He was going to kill all three of them. He had stalked the deputy for a week. He'd had him in his sights, his finger on the trigger, and he had not pulled it. He did not know if it was cowardice or a last flickering piece of his soul. He had thrown the rifle in the river and ridden into the mountains, a widower from the war, now a brother to a ghost. He had built this cabin with his own hands, and he had let the man inside him turn to stone. Willa saw the rage in him. She saw it when he split wood, the axe rising and falling with a contained, terrifying violence. She saw it in the set of his jaw as he stared out the window. He was a man at war with something inside himself. The storm raged for 6 days. On the 7th, the wind died. The silence was sudden and shocking. That evening, the cabin felt smaller, the air thicker. Willa had cooked supper. A thick stew of rabbit Eli had snared. He ate, as always, in silence. She had finished mending his last shirt. She folded it, the warm fabric soft in her hands. "There," she said, setting it on the table. "That is the last of them. Thank you for the meal, for—" She gestured around the room. "For the shelter. You have been kind." Eli looked at the shirt, then at her. "Kindness ain't got nothing to do with it. Can't let a person freeze. It ain't right." "Still, you saved my life." She was standing near him, closer than she had ever been. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, a solid, furnace-like warmth. He smelled of wood smoke and pine. She did something without thinking. She reached out, her fingers light, and touched the sleeve of his arm. It was a simple gesture, a touch. Eli flinched. He did not just move. He recoiled, pulling his arm back as if she had burned him. He stood up, his chair scraping violently on the wood floor. His face was a mask of confusion and something that looked like pain. "Don't," he said, his voice a low growl. Willa froze, her hand still in the air. The rejection was sharp, physical. It was a slap. She felt the blood rush to her face, a hot tide of humiliation. He saw her as a whore. He had paid her bill, and now she was touching him. He thought she was paying her debt. I'm sorry," she stammered, backing away. "I did not mean. I only meant to say thank you." "Just don't," he said again, harsher this time. He grabbed his coat and went outside, slamming the door behind him. Willa stood in the middle of the room, trembling. She had been wrong. This was not shelter. This was a cage. He did not see her as a person. He saw her as the whispers did, a ruined woman, a burden. She sank onto the stool, her hands covering her face. She had survived freezing, only to be shamed in the one place she had felt safe. He was gone for an hour. When he returned, he did not look at her. He moved to the fire and began to bank it for the night. The tension in the room was so thick she could barely breathe. He turned down the lamp. The room was cast in the red, flickering glow of the embers. He moved to his bed. She moved to her cot. Willa lay there, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The cold from the floor seeped up through the thin mattress. She was colder than she had been all week. She heard him shift in his bed. He was not asleep. He was lying awake, just as she was. The silence was unbearable. It was an accusation. She thought of the inn. She thought of Deputy Lorne. She thought of this man who had saved her, only to recoil from her touch. She could not bear this. She could not bear his disgust. Slowly, she got up from the cot. Eli heard the movement. He tensed. "What is it?" Willa walked, her bandaged feet silent, until she stood in the center of the room. in the pool of firelight. "I am not what they say," she said, her voice shaking, but clear. He turned his head on the pillow. He could see her silhouette, the light catching the side of her face. "I know what you think. You paid my bill. You brought me here. You think that I am like them. The women at the inn." "I don't think nothing," he said, his voice rough. "You flinched," she said, the word raw. "You looked at me. You looked at me like I was unclean." Eli sat up. It ain't you." "Then what is it?" she whispered, taking a step closer. She was standing by the hearth, near his bed. The cold from the floor was making her shiver. "Why are you so afraid of a human touch?" He had no answer. He just stared at her, his face a landscape of shadows. He had not been touched with kindness in 10 years. Not since his wife. Not since before the war. He had forgotten how it felt like a threat. It felt like something breaking. Willa looked at his face. She saw the confusion. She saw the profound animal loneliness. It was a mirror of her own. He was not disgusted. He was afraid. In that moment, she was not the ruined lady, and he was not the hard rancher. They were just two people, trapped by the snow, trapped by their own histories. She took another step. She sat on the edge of the stone hearth, her back to the fire. She was only a few feet from his bed. "It is so cold," she said, not of the room, but of everything. She looked at him, and the last of her Boston pride fell away. She was not begging. She was not offering payment. She was just existing. She leaned forward. It was a small movement. She leaned across the small space between them, her hand bracing on the edge of his rough-hewn bed frame. She kissed him. Her lips were chapped and still cold. It was not a passionate kiss. It was a kiss of profound, desperate sadness. It was a question. It was a statement. "I am here. I am alive. See me." For a second, Eli was perfectly still. He did not respond. His lips were firm, unmoving under hers. He tasted of coffee and wood smoke. Then he broke it. He pushed her, not hard, but with a sudden, panicked strength. He shoved her shoulder, pushing her back, scrambling away from her to the far side of his bed. "Get out!" he said, his voice hoarse. Willa fell back, catching herself on the hearth. The heat stung her hands. The humiliation was total. It was a physical sickness. She had offered the last, barest piece of herself, and he had thrown it back at her. "No," he said, louder, scrambling to his feet. He was standing in the shadows, his breathing ragged. "I won't. I can't." He could not handle it. The touch, the kiss, the sudden, raw intimacy. It was too much. It was a door he had nailed shut, and she was trying to break it down. He felt suffocated. Willa stood up. Her face was white. The tears that came this time were not of sorrow. They were of a cold, hard rage. "I see," she said, her voice dead. "I have misunderstood. You are not a kind man. You are just a coward." She turned, her back to him, and walked to the cot. She picked up her coat. It was still damp. She pulled it on. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "I am leaving." She grabbed her ruined, frozen shoes. "I would rather freeze than stay another minute in this room with you." "Don't be a fool," he said, his voice shaking. "It's 20 below. You won't make it a mile." "That is my choice," she said. She hobbled to the door, her movement stiff with pain and pride. "You saved my life, Mr. Travers. Now I'm giving it back." She reached for the heavy bar. "Stop!" The word was sharp, a command. She ignored him, her fingers fumbling with the cold wood. In 2 strides, he was across the room. He grabbed her arm, his grip like a steel trap. He spun her around. His face was inches from hers. He was terrified. It was not a fear of her, but of himself, of the thing she had woken up. "I said stop," He breathed. "Let go of me," she said, trying to pull free. "You can't go," he said. "Why?" she spat. "Because you paid for me? Because you own me, like the men in Boston, like the men at the inn." "No!" he roared. The words shook the small cabin. He was trembling, his grip on her arm tightening. Because... He could not say it. He could not say that her touch had felt like fire. He could not say that her kiss had broken something in him he thought was long dead. He could not say that the thought of her walking out into that snow, of finding her frozen body in the morning, was more than he could bear. Willa stared at him, her chest heaving. He let go of her arm. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair. He looked lost, a man stranded in his own home. He looked at the door, then at her. He saw her pride, her fury, her desperation. He saw himself, 10 years ago, full of rage and grief. He took a deep breath. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of the wind. He met her eyes. His were full of a raw, painful confusion. "Don't go," he said. The words were not a command, they were a plea. The truce was a thin sheet of ice over deep water. The morning after her failed escape, the air in the cabin was brittle. Willa woke on the cot, the humiliation of the night before sitting like a stone in her gut. He had pleaded, "Don't go," but it had not been a plea of affection. It was the plea of a man who did not want a corpse on his conscience. Eli was already at the stove, frying bacon. The smell filled the room, sharp and savory. He did not look at her when she rose, her movement stiff. He pushed a tin plate onto the table, along with a mug of black coffee. "Eat," he said. His back was to her. She ate. She ate because she was starving, and because her pride, it seemed, had frozen to death on the trail. They did not speak of the kiss or the door. They did not speak at all. And then the snow began again. It had paused for a day, a cruel trick. Now it returned with a vengeance, not as flakes, but as a solid, white wall descending from the sky. The wind did not howl. It screamed. It was a siege. For 3 days, Eli could not even reach the barn. They were locked inside, the world reduced to the 4 log walls. The snow piled up past the bottom of the window, casting the room in a dim, gray light, even at noon. The silence became unbearable. It was no longer a truce, it was a confinement. "I need to check the horse," Eli said on the 4th day. The wind had lessened, but the snow was piled 6 feet deep against the door. He spent an hour digging a trench to the outside. Willa watched him, his body a solid block of muscle and will, fighting the wilderness. When he finally got the door open, the cold that entered the cabin was not air, but a physical thing, a presence that stung the lungs. He came back inside. Snow caked in his beard. "The bay is fine, but the wood pile is almost buried." "I will help," she said. He looked at her feet, still wrapped in linen. "You'll stay here." "I cannot," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I cannot sit on this cot like a piece of cargo. My feet are better. Give me boots." He stared at her, then went to a large chest. He pulled out a pair of heavy wool socks and hide-bound boots, worn and oiled. "My wife's," he said. The words hung in the air. She was a small woman. Willa pulled them on. They were a man's boots, but small, and with the thick socks, they fit. He took her to the barn. It was a short distance, but the journey through the trench he had dug was arduous. The air burned. Inside, the relative warmth and the smell of hay and animal musk were a relief. His bay horse, a sturdy animal named Griffin, nickered at him. "You need to learn," he said, not looking at her. "If something happens, if you have to leave." He began with the horse. He showed her how to brush him down, how to check his hooves for ice. His movements were economical, patient. Then he pulled a heavy saddle from a rack. "You'll learn this." He taught her to saddle the horse. His hands were rough as he guided hers, placing them on the straps, showing her how to test the cinch. "Not too tight," he said, his voice low, close to her ear. "But tight enough he can't buck it. Feel here. You should just be able to get 2 fingers in." She did, her fingers sliding between the warm belly of the horse and the leather. His hand was on top of hers. It was not a touch of panic or of anger. It was the touch of a teacher. It was practical. It was the first time they had touched without it ending in rejection. She did not pull away. She focused on the task, on the complex smell of leather and horse and the cold, clean scent of the man beside her. "Good," he said, stepping back. "Again." She did it 3 times, until her fingers, clumsy with cold, learned the motion. She had a purpose. In the evenings, the balance shifted. The cabin was lit only by the fire and a single kerosene lamp. The wind had started again. A low, mournful sound. Eli sat at the table, a small, leather-bound ledger in front of him. She saw him tracing the lines with his finger, his lips moving almost imperceptibly. He was not a fast reader. Willa, restless, moved to the piano. Her fingers found the keys. She played the same broken melody, the notes dull. "What is that?" he asked, not looking up. "It is nothing," she said, "just a piece of a sonata by Beethoven." "It's just marks on a page," he said, gesturing to the sheet music stacked on the piano, warped by damp. "My mother tried to show me. It's a foolish thing." "It is not foolish," she said softly. "It is another language, the same as your ledger." She hobbled to the table, her wrapped feet quiet. She pulled a chair over, wincing. "This," she said, pointing to the music. "This is time. This is how long you hold the note. And this," she pointed to the staff, "is how high or low. It is a map for a sound." He looked at the page. "It's just dots." "Listen." She sat at the piano. She pointed to a note. "This is C." She played it. The sour note rang out. She pointed to the next mark. "This is E." She played it. Together, they make a sound that is steady. She played the chord. He listened. He looked from her finger on the page to her hand on the keys. "Now, this," she said, pointing to a different combination. "This is sad. The map tells you how to make the sadness." She played the minor chord. It hung in the small, warm room, stark and clear. Eli looked at her. He was seeing her, perhaps for the time, not as a burden or a stray or a ruined woman. He was seeing a skill he did not possess. He was seeing the world she came from, a world that had maps for sadness. "She played that one," he said, his voice quiet. "The sad one." A new silence settled, not of tension, but of shared space. He taught her how to bank the fire and check a snare line. She taught him the difference between a whole note and a quarter note. They were 2 people in a box, finding a way to exist. One night, the conversation went deeper. The snow had finally stopped. The moon was out, and the world outside the window was a landscape of impossible, glittering blue-white. It was beautiful and terrible. It meant the cold was deeper than ever. Travel was impossible. The passes would be closed for another month, maybe more. They were trapped. The emotional proximity, forced by the blizzard, had become a fact. Willa was at the piano. She had found a rag and some oil and had been cleaning the keys, the wood. She played a scale, then a chord. "I used to dream," she said, her back to him. "I dreamed I would play in a place called Carnegie Hall, in New York City. My teacher said I had the hands for it. He said I had the fire." Eli was cleaning his rifle, the pieces laid out on an oiled cloth. He did not stop, but his movement slowed. "My father," she continued, her voice very low. "He loved to hear me play. He would sit in his study, and I would play for hours. He said it was the only thing that calmed the noise, in his head. She stopped, her hands resting on the yellowed keys. When he died, everything died. The house was sold. The piano, the men who had been his friends. They looked at me differently. Mr. Abernathy, who bought the debt, he looked at me as if I were a piece of furniture that came with the house. Part of the bill. She traced a crack in one of the keys. I was not a person anymore. I was a scandal. I was the pianist who was now destitute. I was the daughter of a suicide. And when I would not accept Mr. Abernathy's protection, the whispers started, that I was ruined, that I was desperate. They were right about one thing. She looked down at her hands. I am desperate. I am unfit for any decent work. I am not a teacher. I am not a governess. I am just a woman who knows how to play a broken piano in a snowstorm. Eli finished wiping the barrel. He began to reassemble the rifle. His movements sure and steady. The metallic click of the pieces sliding together was the only sound. When he was done, he set the rifle against the wall. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. And then he poured one for her. He set it on the piano. "My sister," he said, his voice flat. Willa turned on the stool. He was not looking at her. He was staring into the fire, his profile hard against the glow. Her name was Mary. She was 19. She was full of life, liked yellow ribbons. He drank his coffee. There was a deputy in town, name of Coulson. He wanted her. She wouldn't have him. She was promised to a boy from the next county. One day, Mrs. Gable's locket went missing from the mercantile, a silver one. Coulson said he found it in Mary's room. He'd put it there, of course. Willa put her hand to her mouth. They had a trial. Took one day. The judge was Coulson's uncle. They found her guilty. Theft. He said the word as if it tasted like poison. They set the hanging for the next morning. I went, he said, his voice dropping to a low, ragged whisper. I went with a rifle. I was going to burn the town down, but they were ready. They put me in the jail, and they made me watch. He closed his eyes. The whole town was there. They watched. Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith, people we had known our whole lives. They watched her hang. For a locket. She cried. She called my name. He opened his eyes. They were not sad. They were dead. I got out 2 days later. I went after Coulson. I hunted him for a week. I had him in my sights, on a ridge. I was going to shoot him in the gut. Let him die slow. What happened? Willa whispered. I didn't, Eli said. I sat there for an hour, and I just could not. I think she wouldn't have wanted it. Or maybe I was just a coward. I don't know. He finished his coffee and set the mug down with a heavy thud. I rode up here. I buried my wife, who died of the fever 2 years before. I buried my mother, and then I buried Mary. And I ain't been back to town. Less I have to. The town, the people, they're poison. He looked at her, his eyes raw. They're just waiting to watch something die. The confession hung in the air, thick and heavy as the snow outside. He had given her his deepest wound, a thing more private than his own body. He had answered her story of shame with his story of rage and grief. Willa stood up. She walked to him, her feet shuffling in the oversized boots. She stood in front of him, so close she could feel the heat of the fire on her face and the heat of his body behind her. She looked at his face, the hard lines, the old pain. She kissed him again. This time it was not the desperate, questioning kiss of a woman on the edge. It was a kiss of understanding. It was a kiss that said, I see you. I see your grief. He did not pull away. He froze. She felt the tension in his shoulders, the sudden, sharp intake of his breath. She did not retreat. She held the kiss, her lips soft against his chapped, hard mouth. And then he responded. It was slow, hesitant. It was the movement of a man unlearning a decade of solitude. His hand, calloused and rough, came up, not to push her away, but to cup the back of her head. His fingers tangled in her hair. It was not a gentle touch. It was clumsy and shaking and desperate. He kissed her back. It was not the kiss of a lover. It was the kiss of a drowning man. It was intense and raw and full of all the words he could not say. It tasted of coffee and loneliness and a grief so profound it had become a part of him. He pulled her closer, his other arm coming around her waist, lifting her off her feet, pressing her body against his. She could feel the hard muscle of his chest, the hammering of his heart. It was terrifying, and it was the safest she had felt in a year. He broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers. His breathing was ragged. "Willa," he breathed. It was the first time he had used her name. She did not know what came next. There was no map for this. He did not let her go. He carried her, not to his bed, but to the pallet of furs and worn quilts she had made for herself by the fire, the warmest place in the cabin. He laid her down, and for a moment, he just looked at her, his face full of a wild confusion. "Eli," she whispered. That was all. He lay down beside her, pulling the heavy quilts over both of them. It was an act of both tenderness and pure, animal desperation. He touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. She leaned into his touch. They came together under the weight of the quilts. In the red glow of the fire, it was slow and awkward and profoundly human. It was a fumbling, silent conversation. It was the tenderness of his hands, so rough, being so careful. It was the desperation of her body, clinging to his, a living anchor in a world that had tried to cast her adrift. It was not about love. It was about survival. It was about two ghosts, realizing they were still alive. Afterward, tangled in the blankets, they lay and listened to the fire crackle. The wind had died. The silence of the mountain had returned. The next morning was quiet, but it was a different quiet. Willa woke first, wrapped in the quilts, her body aching, but warm. He was still asleep, his face turned toward her. In sleep, the hard lines were gone. He looked younger and unguarded. She felt a sudden, sharp ache in her chest that was not pain and not sorrow. She rose, slipping out of the blankets, and pulled on his long wool shirt, the one she had been using as a nightgown. It hung to her knees. She stirred the fire, adding a log, and put the coffee on. When he woke, he watched her. He sat up, running a hand over his face. She brought him a mug. She did not know what to say. "Thank you," he said. She handed him the coffee, and her fingers brushed his. He did not flinch. She did not pull away. Their hands lingered, a brief, warm contact. It's cold," she said, stating the obvious. His eyes softened. The hard, gray stone was gone. They were just gray. "It'll warm up, soon." The movements in the cabin changed. They moved around each other, a new, shy choreography. He would pass behind her at the stove, and his hand would rest on her back for just a moment. She would mend his glove, and he would watch her fingers, a small, almost smile on his face. Later that day, Willa was sweeping the hearth. Her fingers brushed against a small, tin box tucked onto a low shelf behind the woodpile, a place she had not looked before. She pulled it out. It was simple, not locked. "Eli!" He was at the table, checking his supply ledger. "What is it?" "This box. I found it." He looked up. His face went still. It was Mary's. Willa's hand recoiled. "I am sorry. I should not have—" "It's all right," he said. He was quiet for a long time. She kept letters in it." Willa held the box. She should put it back. It was not hers. It was his holiest, most private grief. "You can read them," he said, his voice thick. "Eli, Go on." He looked down at his ledger, but he was not seeing it. I can't, but you can." He was giving her the last piece of him, the piece he had kept hidden even from himself. She sat by the fire, her hands trembling, and opened the box. Inside were 3 letters, tied with a piece of faded yellow ribbon, and a locket, a simple, silver locket. Willa gasped. "Eli, this is—" "He threw it back at me," Eli said, his voice dead. "The day I left, Coulson, he threw it at me in the street, said he didn't want it, said it wasn't worth the trouble." Willa opened a letter. The handwriting was round, girlish. It was to her young man, the one in the next county. It was full of talk of the weather, of a new dress, of a dance. It was full of a life that was simple and happy and 19. Willa began to cry, not for Eli, but for Mary, for the girl who liked yellow ribbons. Eli did not move. He sat and listened to her weep. He had not allowed anyone to do that. He had not allowed anyone to share that grief. He had held it alone, a ball of ice in his chest. And now, watching her cry, he felt it, for the first time, begin to melt. The sound of the outside world was a shock. A loud, heavy banging on the door. Both of them froze. Eli was on his feet in an instant, the rifle in his hands, moving to the side of the door. "Who is it?" he called. "Eli, it's Jedediah," a voice boomed. "Jedediah Stone, just checking on you. Figured the storm might have buried you." Eli relaxed, but only slightly. He lowered the rifle and unbarred the door. He opened it. A large, bearded man stood there, covered in snow, a wide, friendly smile on his face. "By God, Eli, you're alive. We was worried. Ain't seen sign of you in 3 weeks. "Jed," Eli said, nodding. "I'm fine. Storm was rough." "Rough?" Jed laughed, stepping inside, stamping snow from his boots. "It was a biblical. I lost 2 head of cattle, but I see you're warm." His eyes landed on Willa. She was standing by the fire, frozen, her hand still holding Mary's letter. She was barefoot. She was wearing nothing but Eli Travers's long wool shirt. Jed's smile did not fade, but it froze. His eyes flickered. He looked from Willa's bare feet to her hair, tumbled down from sleep, to the pallet of furs and quilts by the fire, clearly large enough for 2. Then he looked at Eli. "Well," Jed said, a new, knowing tone in his voice. "I see you ain't been alone." Eli's face hardened. She was stranded. The storm. "Aye," Jed said, nodding slowly, his eyes twinkling, but not with kindness. "The storm. It does tend to bring folks together." He backed toward the door. "Well, I'll let the town know you're fine, that you're comfortable." "Jed," Eli said, his voice a low warning. "Good day, Eli, ma'am." Jed touched his hat, gave Willa one last, long look, and left, pulling the door closed. Eli barred it. He and Willa stood in the silence. The cabin was warm, but the cold of the outside world had found them. "He will tell them," Willa said, her voice dead. She was clutching the shirt, her shame returning like a sickness. "Aye," Eli said, his voice hard as iron. "He'll tell them." Word would get out. Jedediah Stone was a man who enjoyed news, and he was not a man to keep it to himself. The word traveled as fast as a horse could run through the melting snow. It started at the mercantile, moved to the blacksmith's forge, and settled, like a cloud of thick smoke, in the common room of the Overland Hotel. Eli Travers, the widower recluse, the man who hated the town, he had a woman up there. And not just any woman, that one from the east, the ruined one, the one who had showed up with fine clothes and no money, the one Hesh had thrown out. He had paid for her. They said he was keeping her. In the cabin, the silence had returned. But it was a changed thing. After Jed's visit, the warm, shared privacy of their sanctuary felt breached. The world had looked in, and it had left its dirty boot prints on the floor. Willa was quiet, her shame a living presence in the room. She had stopped wearing Eli's shirt as a nightgown, sleeping instead in her own mended dress, as if to build a wall of propriety around herself. Eli felt the change. He felt her withdrawal. It made him angry. He went back to splitting wood with a grim, punishing violence, the thwack of the axe against the logs echoing off the mountainside. He was angry at Jed, at the town, and at the look he had seen on Willa's face, the look of a thing that had been caught and branded. He knew what they would be saying. He had heard the whispers about his sister, Mary, before they'd hanged her. Fast girl, asked for it. Now they would be saying the same of Willa. Used up, soiled goods, working for him in more ways than one. The poison of the town was a thing he knew well. They did not touch. The tentative, shy choreography of their days had frozen. They were back to being two strangers in a box. Only now the box had a window, and the world was staring in. A week after Jed's visit, a rider came. Willa saw him first, from the small window. It was not Jed's lumbering workhorse. This was a finer animal, and the man on it wore a uniform. A tin star was pinned to his coat. Her heart stopped. She knew him. It was Deputy Lorne, the man with the wet eyes and the cruel offer of work. "Eli," she said, her voice a dry whisper. He was inside, mending a harness strap. He looked up at her face, and he knew. He set the leather down and moved to the door, taking his rifle from the rack. He did not check if it was loaded. He knew it was. He stepped out onto the small porch. Willa watched from the doorway, her hands clutching the frame. Deputy Lorne pulled his horse up a few yards from the porch. He did not dismount. He sat in the saddle, a man enjoying his own authority. He had a thick neck and a face that seemed perpetually damp. "Travers," he called, his voice oily. Eli stood on the porch, the rifle held loose in his right hand, the barrel pointed at the ground. "Lorne." "Heard you had company," Lorne said, letting his eyes slide past Eli to Willa, who was half hidden in the shadows of the door. "Town's worried. We don't like to see a lady in distress." He smiled, showing stained teeth. "She ain't in distress," Eli said. His voice was flat, like a stone. "Ain't she?" Lorne stroked his chin. "Last I saw her, she was destitute at the inn. I offered her respectable work, cleaning the jail. She refused. Now she's up here, with you." He made the words an accusation. "Folks are wondering if she's here of her own free will." "She is," Eli said. "Why don't you let her speak for herself?" Lorne's gaze fixed on Willa. "Miss Morgan, you all right? You ain't being held, are you? You just say the word, and I'll take you back to town, find you that work I mentioned." His meaning was clear. His protection, in exchange for hers. Willa felt sick. This was her fault, all of it. Before she could find her voice, Eli spoke. "She's not going anywhere." Lorne's smile tightened. "So, it's like that? Jed was right. You're keeping her, Travers. The good people of Coldwater Springs don't abide by this. We're a decent town. We don't like seeing a soiled woman living in open sin. It's an offense." "This is my land," Eli said. The air around him had gone cold. "This is Montana territory," Lorne countered, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his own pistol. "And I'm the law. I'm here on an official complaint. You are harboring a vagrant, and, by the look of her, contributing to the delinquency of—" "Get off my land," Eli said. The words were not loud. They were quiet. Lorne laughed. A short, ugly bark. "Or what, old man? You'll shoot an officer of the law." "I'll shoot a trespasser," Eli said. And he raised the rifle. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. The rifle was up. The stock settled against his shoulder, his eyes sighting down the barrel. The click of the hammer being pulled back was the loudest sound on the mountain. Lorne's horse felt the tension and sidestepped. Nervous, Lorne's face went pale. The oily smile vanished. He saw the look in Eli's eyes. It was the look he had seen in the mirror just before he'd lied about Mary. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose. "You're crazy," Lorne stammered, pulling back on his reins. "You've lost your mind, Travers." "Last time," Eli said, his voice deadly calm. "Get off my land." Lorne yanked his horse's head around. "This ain't over. You hear me? This ain't over. I'll be back with a warrant. We'll see how brave you are then, hiding behind that whore." He kicked his horse into a run, galloping away through the slush and mud, not looking back. Eli did not lower the rifle. He stood there for a full minute, watching, until Lorne was just a speck down the trail. Then he lowered the hammer, slowly, and let the rifle hang at his side. He turned and went back inside the cabin. The silence was absolute. Willa was standing where he had left her, white and trembling. The word Lorne had used, whore, hung in the air, a physical, stinging thing. Eli set the rifle back on the rack. He walked to the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee. His hand was perfectly steady. Willa finally moved. "You see," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You see what I am." Eli did not turn. "It ain't what you are. It's what he is." "He is the town," she cried, the words bursting out of her. "He is the world, and I've brought him to your door. I am poison. Eli, I am just like my father. I am a sickness. I ruin everything I touch." "Stop it," he said, his voice low. "I should have died in that snow," she went on, the hysteria rising. "You should have left me. It would have been a kindness. Now you've made an enemy of the law. For what? For me? For what he called me?" "I said, stop it." He slammed the coffee mug down on the table, the hot liquid sloshing over the rim. He turned on her, his face a mask of cold fury. "This ain't about you. This is about them. It's always been about them. That town, that filth. And you just hide from it," she shot back, her shame turning to a wild, sudden rage. "You hide up here on your mountain, pretending it doesn't exist. You think you're better than them, but you're a coward. You let them do what they want. You let them hang your sister, and you ran, and now you're just hiding." The blow landed. She saw it. She saw the blood drain from his face, replaced by a dark, dangerous flush. He had shared his deepest wound, and she had just driven a knife into it. "A coward?" he whispered. He crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh. "You think I'm a coward?" He was shaking, his rage a tangible thing, radiating from him like heat. "You come here," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "Barefoot, half dead, from a world that threw you away like garbage. And you call me a coward? You, who have been hiding behind me since the first snow?" "I didn't ask for this," she wept, trying to pull free. "You play that damned piano," he sneered, his own pain making him cruel. "All sad and broken. You sit by the fire, looking for pity. You think you're the only one in the world who's ever lost something. You think your Boston sadness is special? It ain't. It's just noise." He shoved her away from him. The word hit her harder than his hand. Noise, her music, the last piece of her soul. He had called it noise. She stumbled back, hitting the wall. The fight was gone, replaced by a cold, profound emptiness. He had broken her. "Yes," she said, her voice dead. "You are right. It's just noise." Eli stared at her, the fury draining from him, replaced by a dawning horror at what he had said. He saw her face, the life draining out of it. "Willa," he started. "I didn't—" "Do not," she said, holding up a hand. She walked, her back straight, to the cot. She sat down. She turned her face to the wall. He had won. He had silenced her. Eli stood in the middle of the room, his chest heaving. He looked at his hand, the one that had grabbed her. He looked at her, a small, still shape on the cot. He grabbed his coat and stormed outside. The sound of his axe splitting wood filled the rest of the day. It was a frantic, punishing rhythm. He did not stop until it was full dark, and his body was screaming with exhaustion. He returned to a cold cabin. The fire was dying, reduced to red embers. Willa had not moved from the cot. She was wrapped in a blanket, facing the wall. He built the fire back up, the scrape of the shovel and the crackle of the new logs the only sound. He made food. He set a plate on the table. "Supper," he said. She did not move. He ate alone. The silence in the cabin was no longer tense. It was dead. He cleaned up. He sat at the table. She lay on the cot. An hour passed. 2. The clock on the wall ticked, each sound a small hammer blow in the stillness. He could not bear it. He had faced down Lorne. But this silence, this he could not fight. He looked at her, at the proud, still line of her back. He had called her music noise. He had thrown her own survival back in her face. He had been a monster. He went to his bed and lay down, fully clothed, on top of the covers. He stared at the ceiling beams. He felt the cold seeping in. He had pushed her away. He had proven her right. He was a coward. He was just like the town. He must have slept, because he woke, his heart pounding. The fire was low again. The cabin was filled with a deep, cold dark. He heard a sound, a bare foot on the floor. He tensed. She was standing. She was standing in the middle of the room, a pale shape in the faint moonlight from the window. She was clutching the blanket around her. She turned to him. "Do you want me to leave?" Her voice was a thread, so quiet he almost did not hear it. It was not an accusation. It was a simple, terrible question. "I will," she said, her voice trembling, but clear. "If you want me to. The snow, it is mostly gone from the trail. I will leave in the morning. I will not bring any more trouble to you." She was giving him the out. She was offering to walk back into the wilderness that had almost killed her. Eli lay still, his chest tight. He saw her standing there, offering to destroy herself to save him. He saw Mary on the gallows, her eyes wide with terror. He saw Lorne's sneering face. He had called her noise. He had called her a coward. He sat up. The bed ropes creaked. "No," he said. His voice was thick. She flinched, as if expecting a blow. She started to turn back to the cot. "Then I will sleep. I am sorry to have—" "No." He was off the bed. He was across the room before she could take a breath. He grabbed her, not by the arm, but by the shoulders, pulling her against him. "I said no," he whispered, his voice ragged, his face buried in her hair. She was stiff in his arms, her body rigid with fear and shame. "Don't," she whispered. "Please." "I ain't," he said, his voice thick with a raw emotion she had never heard. I didn't mean it. What I said, it was a lie." He held her tighter. "It ain't noise. It's the only thing that ain't. It's God, Willa." He pulled back, his hands framing her face. In the dark, he could just see the glint of tears on her cheeks. "Don't leave," he said. It was not a plea. It was a discovery. "Don't you leave." He kissed her. It was not the slow, hesitant kiss of their first night. It was not the desperate, clinging kiss of grief. This was something else. It was raw. It was passionate. And it was rooted in a blind, animal terror. It was the kiss of a man who had just seen the one thing he valued about to walk out the door. He kissed her with a possessive, angry desperation. He was kissing away Lorne's words. He was kissing away his own. She responded. Her hands, which had been trapped between them, came up, clutching his shirt. She kissed him back, matching his fire, her own fear of loss, her own grief, her own rage. It all poured into it. He lifted her, carrying her from the center of the room, past the cold cot, to his bed. He fell with her onto the mattress, pulling the heavy quilts over them, not for warmth, but to blot out the world, to create a new sanctuary. Their second time was a storm. It was not tender. It was a raw, intense claiming. It was driven by the fear of loss. It was two people, battered and broken, clinging to each other as the only solid thing in a world that had tried to drown them both. It was a silent, furious vow. You are mine, I am yours, and the world be damned. The thaw came in earnest. The world, which had been white and silent, turned to brown mud and the sound of dripping water. One morning, nearly a week after the fight, Eli stood by the door, pulling on his coat. "The trail's clear," he said. "Mostly. We need supplies. The flour is gone." Willa, who was washing the breakfast tins, paused. "You are going to town?" "Aye," he said, turning. "We are." She froze. "We?" "You ain't staying here, not alone, not with Lorne knowing." He held out her coat. "And I need you to come." He was not asking her to hide. He was asking her to stand with him. The ride down was slow. The trail was a river of mud and slush. He rode Griffin. He had put her on the gray mule, which was steadier. She wore her own dress, mended and clean, and his dead wife's boots. As they dropped out of the foothills, Coldwater Springs came into view. It was ugly, a collection of drab buildings hunkered in the mud. They rode down the main street. It was as if a silent bell had been rung. Jedediah Stone, outside the Mercantile, stopped loading a wagon. Mrs. Gable, sweeping the boardwalk in front of the hotel, froze, her broom still. Two loggers, drinking beer on the hotel porch, went silent. They were all staring at Eli Travers, the mountain man, and staring at the woman with him. Eli rode as if they were not there. He stopped in front of the hotel, the exact place he had first seen her. He swung down from Griffin. Then he turned to her. Willa's heart was pounding. She felt the stares like tiny, hot needles. She was the Scarlet Woman. She was the whore from the mountain. Eli looked up at her on the mule. He held up his hands to help her down. She hesitated. "Willa," he said, his voice low, "for her only, come on." She took a breath. She swung her leg over and slid down into his arms. He did not let her go immediately. He set her on her feet, but he kept his hands on her waist for a moment, a public, proprietary act. Then he did something that stopped her breath. He took her hand. He did not take her arm, to lead her like property. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. He looked at the staring faces, his gaze flat and cold. Then he looked at her. He gave her a single, sharp nod. And, holding her hand, he walked her past the loggers, past Mrs. Gable, and into the common room of the Overland Hotel. The room went silent. Hesh, the innkeeper, was behind the bar, wiping a glass. He looked up. His eyes widened. He saw Eli. He saw Willa. And he saw their joined hands. Hesh put the glass down. He looked pale. He was a businessman. Eli Travers was a paying customer, but Deputy Lorne was the law. Hesh was caught between them. Eli walked to the bar, Willa still beside him, their hands still linked. "Hesh," Eli said. "Mr. Travers," Hesh said, nodding, his eyes flicking to Willa and then away. "Ma'am?" "We need a room," Eli said. Hesh blinked. "A room? You're staying?" "For the night, and we need supplies from the Mercantile. Send them over. Put it on my bill." This was a declaration. He was not just buying supplies. He was staying with her. Hesh looked at their hands. He looked at the hard set of Eli's jaw. He made a businessman's decision. "Yes, sir, Mr. Travers. Right away." He looked at Willa, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Miss Morgan? About before. It was a bad winter. I'm just—" "I know," Willa said. Her voice was steady. "You are a businessman." I am sorry for your trouble, ma'am," he mumbled. It was an apology. Willa's gaze moved from Hesh to the corner of the room. The inn's piano. It was scarred, and two men were using it to hold their beers. She let go of Eli's hand. He watched her, a question in his eyes. She walked to the piano. "Gentlemen," she said. The loggers, startled, grabbed their beers. "Sorry, ma'am." She sat on the stool. It was worse than Eli's. Half the keys were dead, but she sat up straight, her back rigid, the way she had in Boston. She played the Beethoven. It was a wreck. The notes were sour, flat, and discordant, but she played it, her fingers finding the map, her body swaying with the music. Mrs. Gable had followed them inside. She stood by the door, listening. The loggers were silent. When Willa finished, the notes dying in the smoky air, there was a silence. Then Mrs. Gable spoke, her voice surprisingly soft. That was lovely. Dear, truly, it is nice to hear the piano again." Willa looked at the woman who had whispered about her. "Mrs." Gable's face was not kind. Not yet, but it was not cruel. It was respectful. Willa stood up and walked back to Eli. He took her hand again. They walked out of the inn. Across the street, leaning against the wall of the jail, was Deputy Lorne. He was not smiling. He was watching them. He saw their joined hands. He saw Mrs. Gable in the doorway, watching Willa with something like admiration. He saw Hesh nodding respectfully to Eli. Lorne's face was dark with a cold, patient fury. He spit a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. The town had blinked, but he had not. The trip from town had changed the air between them. When Eli had taken her hand in the muddy street, in front of everyone, he had drawn a line. "She is with me." The whispers had not stopped, but they had changed their character. They had shifted from contempt to a grudging, curious respect. He had claimed her. Back in the cabin, the tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, fragile domesticity. They moved around each other with a new, shared rhythm. He no longer flinched at her touch. He sought it. A hand on his arm as she passed him the coffee, his fingers brushing hers as he took a plate. They spoke more. He told her about his horse, about the way the creek changed in the spring. She told him about Boston, not the shame, but the good things, the smell of the ocean, the libraries, the sound of an orchestra tuning. The pallet of furs by the fire was gone. She slept in his bed. They slept tangled together, a habit born of cold and desperation that had become a simple, nightly comfort. The ghosts were still in the room, but they sat farther back from the fire. The future was a mountain pass, still blocked by snow. They did not speak of it. They lived in the days they had. The mail rider came once a week, if the trail was clear. He was a thin boy of about 16, on a fast pony. He usually rode right past Eli's turnoff. But one afternoon, Willa looked up from feeding the chickens and saw him, slogging his pony up the muddy track to the cabin. "You, Mr. Travers," the boy called, holding up a single, stiff envelope. "Got this, from the depot. It come all the way from Boston. Got a lot of stamps on it." Eli came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. Willa felt a prickle of ice on her skin. Boston. Eli took the envelope. It was thick, creamy paper, addressed in a sharp black script to Miss Willa Morgan, care of General Delivery, Coldwater Springs, Montana Territory. He handed it to her. She took it. Her hands were trembling. She recognized the script. It was from the law firm that had handled her father's estate, or what was left of it. "Willa?" Eli said, watching her face lose its color. She tore it open. It was not a letter. It was a document. She scanned the words, her mind catching on the hard, legal phrases. Whereas, notice of claim, breach of contract, property. She dropped the paper as if it were on fire. It fluttered to the damp wood of the porch. "Willa, what is it?" She backed away, shaking her head, a small, choked sound in her throat. She stumbled, catching herself on the doorframe. The strength she had earned, the peace she had found. It all drained out of her, leaving her as hollow as she had been at the inn. "He found me," she whispered. Eli picked up the letter. He was a slow reader, his finger moving under the words. But he understood the language of ownership. He saw the name, Abernathy. He saw the phrases, marriage contract, surety against debt, claim upon her person. "What is this?" he said, his voice a low growl. "Debtor's bride?" It was the last thing he signed. Willa wept, sinking onto the bench by the door. "My father, he owed Mr. Abernathy so much money. Abernathy took the house, the stocks, everything. And then he said there was still a debt, a large one." She was shaking so hard she could barely speak. "He came to the house, after the funeral. He smiled. He told me not to worry. He said my father, in his wisdom, had provided for me. He showed me the contract. My father had signed me to him. An agreement of marriage, in exchange for forgiving the final debt. I was the last asset, the last piece of the Morgan estate." Eli's face was stone, but his hands had clenched the paper so tightly his knuckles were white. "I told him no," she continued, her voice raw. "I told him he was a monster. He just laughed. He said the paper was legal. He said I had no choice. He said he didn't want a wife who loved him. He wanted one who was grateful. He wanted to own me, to break me, because I had refused him before, when my father was alive." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a terror he had not seen since the day she'd arrived. "That is why I ran. Eli, I took the last of my mother's jewelry. The pieces he hadn't found. I sold them, and I ran. I thought if I disappeared, he would let it go. I thought he could not find me, out here, but he found me." She pointed a trembling finger at the letter. "He is coming. His representative. He is coming to collect me." Eli stood there, the letter in his fist. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the mountains, at the hard, clear line of the peaks. He remembered the deputy's threat. "I'll be back. Lauren must have sent a telegraph, inquiring about her, seeking a reward or just stirring up trouble." And the trouble had come. This was not a town deputy. This was the East. This was the law that had stolen his sister's life. The paper law that cared nothing for justice, only for what was written. He crushed the paper in his hand. "He ain't coming here," Eli said. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "He has papers. He has the law." "This is my land," Eli said, his voice quiet, but with a finality that cut through her panic. He turned to her. He knelt, so his eyes were level with hers. He took her shaking hands in his. "He is not taking you." He said it like a vow. "I'm not letting any man take what's mine." The words hung in the air. "What's mine?" Willa stopped crying. She looked at him, her gaze searching his face, his hard, gray eyes. He had claimed her in the street, with his hand. He had claimed her in their bed, with his body. But this was something more. "What am I, Eli?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your property, like his?" "No," he said, his grip tightening. "Not like his." "Then tell me," she said, her voice desperate. "Tell me I'm yours. Not just something you saved from the snow? Not just for a warm night?" He looked at her, at the raw, desperate need in her eyes. She needed an anchor. She needed a word to fight the words on that paper. He had lived a decade without soft words. He did not know how to say it. He did not know if the word was love. He only knew that the thought of this man from Boston, this, Abernathy, putting his hands on her, made him want to burn the world down. He knew that her music was not noise. It was the only sound that made sense. He knew that her presence in his cabin was the only thing that had made him human again. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "You're mine, Willa," he breathed. "You are mine." That night, the cabin was still. The threat from the east was a wolf, circling in the dark. But inside, something had settled. The doubt was gone. Willa did not wait for him. She did not lie in the bed and wait for him to come to her. She met him at the hearth. She had finished cleaning, her movements deliberate. He was banking the fire. She came up behind him. He stilled, sensing her. She put her arms around him from behind, her hands flat against his chest, her cheek pressed against the rough wool of his shirt. She felt the solid, steady beat of his heart. He put his hand over hers. "Will," he said, his voice thick. "I am not afraid," she whispered, though she was. Not with you." She turned him around. She looked up at his face, at the man who had been a ghost, and she kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion or fear. It was a kiss of choice. It was slow and deep and full of a profound, quiet gravity. It was the sealing of a vow. "I am yours. You are mine." She initiated. She led him to the bed. This time, there was no desperation. There was no grief. It was not a collision. It was a claiming. She wanted him to see her, all of her, not as the ruined woman, but as the woman who had chosen him. She wanted him to claim her as something sacred, something whole. And he did. His touch, once hesitant, once raw with need, was now sure. It was tender. It was possessive. It was the touch of a man who had finally, after a decade of cold, found something he would kill to protect. They moved together in the quiet dark, their bodies speaking a language of belonging that no paper, no law, could ever challenge. The next morning, Willa woke up to an empty bed. It was just past dawn. The fire was lit and the coffee was on. She panicked for a moment, thinking he had gone. She pulled on his shirt and went to the door. He was not gone. He was in the small barn. She heard a sound, not the rhythm of an axe, but the steady shh of a wood plane. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and walked, barefoot, across the damp, cold ground to the barn. He was there, in the gray morning light. He had a piece of oak, a thick, smooth plank, resting on two sawhorses. He was working it with a hand plane, his movements long and sure. There were other pieces on the ground, carefully cut. "Eli!" He stopped, looking up. He was not the grim man of the mountain. His face was calm, focused. "You'll catch your death," he said, his eyes dropping to her bare feet. "What are you doing?" she asked, looking at the wood. It was good wood, hardwood, the kind he saved. He ran his hand over the planed surface. "My mother," he said, not looking at her. "She had a bench for the piano. It was proper. That stool you use, it's wobbly. It ain't right." He picked up a piece he had already carved. It was a leg, thick and sturdy, with a simple, clean curve. "A woman," he said, his voice rough, "needs a proper place to sit, if she's to play." Willa stared at the piece of wood. It was not a stool. It was not temporary. He was building her a piano bench. He was building her a future. He was telling her that her music, the noise he had once scorned, was now a permanent part of his home. He was not a man of rings. He was a man of wood and stone and things that lasted. "How many words?" he asked, not with a ring, but with a piano bench. Tears welled, hot and sudden. She did not wipe them away. She walked to him, stood in the flying sawdust. and kissed him, tasting the wood on his lips. "Yes," she whispered. He did not understand. "Yes, what?" "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Just yes." He held her, his arms strong, smelling of oak and sweat. The representative arrived 3 days later. He did not come on a horse. He came in a rented buggy, the kind that got stuck in the mud. He was a small man in a dark, expensive suit and a bowler hat. He looked like a crow. And he was not alone. Deputy Lorne rode beside him, his badge polished, his smirk firmly in place. Eli saw them coming from a mile off. He had been watching. "Willa," he said, his voice calm. "Go inside. Bar the door. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." "Eli, no." "Do it, Willa." It was a command. She fled inside, her heart pounding. She heard the heavy thud of the bar sliding into place. Eli stood on the porch, waiting. He was not wearing his gun. His rifle was just inside the door, leaning where he could reach it. He just stood, his hands empty, waiting. The buggy pulled up. The man, Finch, stepped out, trying to avoid the mud on his polished shoes. Lorne dismounted, swaggering. "That's him," Lorne said. "Travers." Finch pulled a stack of papers from his breast pocket. "Mr. Eli Travers? I am Mr. Finch, representative of the Abernathy estate, from Boston." Eli said nothing. He just watched. "I am here," Finch said, puffing his chest, "on a matter of legal reclamation. We have a contract, a duly executed writ of possession for the person of Miss Willa Morgan." "You ain't," Eli said. Finch blinked. I beg your pardon? This is a legal document. She is, by law, the property of Mr. Abernathy, to be claimed as his debtor's bride. Deputy Lorne is here to see this document enforced." Lorne stepped forward. "Travers, the game is up. This ain't town gossip. This is the law, from the East. You turn her over, or you're obstructing justice." "She ain't here," Eli said. Lorne laughed. "We saw her just this morning at the creek. Don't lie, old man. It's unbecoming." Finch stepped onto the porch. "Mr. Travers, I will have her. You can do this simply, or we can have the deputy." "This is my land," Eli said, his voice dropping to the deadly calm Willa knew. "And you are a trespasser. Get off it." "Now, see here," Finch sputtered. "Deputy, do your duty. Arrest this man." Lorne put his hand on his pistol. "Last chance. Travers, step aside." "No." A sound came from the trail. A horse, then another. Lorne turned. Finch turned. Jedediah Stone rode into the clearing, his large frame casual in the saddle. He was holding a deer rifle across his lap. Behind him came the blacksmith, Mr. Gable, on a mule, and 2 other ranchers from the valley, men Eli had not spoken to in 10 years. They, too, were armed. They fanned out, creating a silent, uncrossable line between the cabin and the buggy. Jed stopped his horse. "Morning, Deputy Mr. Travers." Lorne's hand fell away from his gun. "Jed, this ain't your concern. This is official business." "Is it?" Jed said, stroking his beard. He looked at the man in the bowler hat. "You look a long way from home, mister." "This is a legal matter," Finch said, his voice high and thin. "I have papers." "Papers," Jed said, as if the word was new to him. "Well, now, we don't hold much with Boston paper. Round here." "Mr. Gable spoke, his voice a low rumble. "We hold with our neighbors, and Mr. Travers is our neighbor." Eli stood, stunned. These men, the men of the town he had hated, the town that had watched his sister die. "You are abetting a criminal," Finch shrieked. "You're nothing but vigilantes." No, sir, Jed said, his voice hardening. We're just the community, and we don't hold with claiming folks, especially not a lady. Seems indecent. He looked at Lorne. Don't it, deputy? Lorne was pale. His authority was gone. The men with him were not his friends. They were the valley, and they had chosen the recluse over the law. This ain't right, Jed, Lorne said, his voice weak. Seems right to me, Jed said. He looked at Finch. Your buggy's pointed toward town. I'd suggest you get in it. The trail's muddy. You'll want to be back before dark. It was a dismissal. Finch looked at the four-armed men. He looked at Eli, who had not moved. He looked at the cabin, where the woman was hidden. He was a man of paper, not of lead. This is an outrage, he sputtered. He snatched his papers, scrambled back into his buggy, and whipped the horse, the wheels spinning in the mud. Lorne was left alone. He looked at Jed. He looked at Eli. His face was a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. He had been humiliated. This ain't over, he snarled at Eli. It is, Eli said. Lorne mounted his horse and rode after the buggy. Defeated. Eli stood on the porch as the ranchers watched them go. When they were out of sight, Jedediah nodded, once, to Eli. Mr. Travers, he said. Jed, Eli replied. It was all that was needed. Jed and the others turned their horses and rode away. Willa burst from the door, her face wet with tears. She threw her arms around Eli, burying her face in his chest. He held her, his arms a steel band. They had won. Not the law, the community. The town that had once been poison had just redeemed itself. A week later, Willa rode to town, alone. Eli had offered to come. She had said no, she had to do this herself. She went to the small, white, clapboard church. She found Mrs. Gable inside, dusting the pews. Mrs. Gable, Willa said. The woman turned, her face guarded. Miss Morgan. It is Mrs. Travers, Willa said, her voice clear and steady. Or it will be, soon. Mrs. Gable's eyes widened. A slow smile spread across her face. Well, that is good news. He is a good man. Eli, a hard one, but a good one. I know, Willa said. I came to offer the harmonium for Sunday service. It is out of tune, but I can make it work, if you'll have me. Mrs. Gable looked at this woman. She was not the fine lady from Boston. She was not the ruined creature from the inn. She was the woman who had tamed Eli Travers and faced down a Boston lawyer. We would be honored, Mrs. Travers, she said. She paused. And my Clara, she bangs on the keys, but she has a desire. I do not know if you... I would be happy to teach her, Willa said, her heart swelling. That afternoon, Willa sat at the wheezing church harmonium. The new piano bench was at the cabin, but this would do. Beside her stood 3 small children, Clara Gable among them. This, Willa said, her back straight, her hands finding the keys, is a map, and this is how we read it. She played a note, and the children, their voices high and reedy, sang it back. She was no longer a scandal. She was the music teacher. Spring did not arrive. It fought. It came in a series of skirmishes, melting the snow into a thick, drowning mud, then freezing it again in a sudden, spiteful snap. But the sun was higher, and the fight was one-sided. The roaring of the creek, once muffled, became the dominant sound in the valley. The ice on the high peaks cracked and thundered, and then, one day, the smell of damp earth and pine sap was stronger than the smell of the cold. The cabin door, which had been a barrier against death, now stood open most of the day. The light that filled the room was no longer a flat, gray glare, but a warm, yellow wash. Willa's laughter came with the spring. It was a sound Eli had not known the valley could hold. He had known her soft voice, her whispers of fear, and the low, steady tones of her determination, but he had never heard her laugh. It happened when he bought a cow. He'd traded pelts for a skinny milk cow from Jedediah Stone, figuring they needed it. He'd brought it back, a brown and white creature with skeptical eyes, and handed Willa the pail. She, the woman who had played Beethoven in Boston salons, looked at the animal as if it were a foreign dignitary she was meant to disarm. I have never, she stammered. Sit, Eli had said, pointing to the three-legged stool. Be firm. She'll know if you're afraid. Willa sat. She touched the cow's flank. The cow turned its head and regarded her with profound disappointment. Willa tried, her long, pale fingers, now chapped and strong from chores. Fumbling, the cow switched its tail, swatting her neatly across the face. Eli, leaning against the new fence post, almost smiled. Willa tried again. She managed a weak, thin stream of milk that hissed into the pail. She tried a second time, and the cow, sighing with impatience, shifted its weight, kicked the pail, and sent a quart of milk splashing all over Willa's skirt. Willa sat there, dripping, the empty pail on its side, the silence stretched. Eli tensed, waiting for the tears, for the frustration, for the shame of failure. And Willa Morgan burst out laughing. It was not a giggle. It was a full, clear, unrestrained laugh that echoed off the wall of the new barn. It was a sound of such pure, uncomplicated joy that Eli froze. He just listened. It was, he thought, the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of a woman who was no longer afraid of being ruined. She does not like me, Willa gasped, wiping milk and tears from her face. Eli walked over, a slow smile cracking his own face, a thing that felt new and strange. She will, he said, taking the stool. You just have to show her who's boss. He sat, and with a few, sure movements. The milk began to drum steadily into the bottom of the pail. Willa watched him, her laughter softening to a smile, and she leaned against his shoulder, her skirt still damp, watching the simple, steady rhythm of their new life. Eli, who had been nearly feral in his grief, was calmer. The change in him was less sudden than the spring, but more permanent. The rage he had carried, the hard, cold stone in his chest, had been worn down. He was no longer a man at war with the world. He was a man building one. He began to ride to town with her. The first time, the town had watched. The second, they had nodded. Now, it was just normal. Willa would go to the church, the small harmonium now almost in tune from her constant care. The sound of children singing, clear and reedy, would drift out over the muddy street. Mrs. Gable met them at the Mercantile one afternoon, pressing a jar of dark plum preserves into Willa's hands. For the teacher, she'd said, and the words were a final, public absolution. Even Eli's ghosts seemed to be at peace. He found himself standing by Jedediah Stone, not speaking of the past, but of the future. That barn of yours, Jed said, tamping tobacco into his pipe. She's raising up proper. Willa's idea, Eli said, the new layout. A woman's touch. Jed nodded, striking a match. It does a place good. You're looking better. Eli, the mountain air seems to be agreeing with you. Finally. It ain't the air, Eli said, looking across the street, where Willa was just emerging from the church, 3 small girls clinging to her hands. No, Jed agreed, smoke pluming around his head. I reckon it ain't. Deputy Lorne was still there. They saw him at the inn, drinking at the bar in the middle of the day. He had lost his swagger. He was just a sour, bitter man whose authority had been revealed as hollow. He would see Eli and Willa, and his face would darken, but he never approached them. The town no longer listened to him. He was just a man with a tin star and a dark memory, and in the bright, clear light of spring, he barely cast a shadow. Their biggest project was the barn. The old one, built by his father, had sagged under the weight of a dozen hard winters, a symbol of Eli's own long neglect. "It has to come down," he'd said one morning. "No," Willa had replied, walking the perimeter, her hand on the rotten wood. "Not down. It needs to be rebuilt." It was an echo of their own lives. They salvaged what they could. The good, solid beams of the foundation, the fieldstone, the rest, the rotten planks, the collapsed roof. They tore it down. It was hard, filthy, satisfying work. He taught her to use a pry bar, and she learned to brace her weight, her body, once thin, now lean and strong. They built the new one together, from the ground up. Eli cut the new timbers, the smell of fresh sawn pine filling the air. Willa learned to hammer a nail. Her first few attempts were clumsy, her pianist's fingers striking bent, crooked nails. "Like this," he said, standing behind her. He put his hand over hers, guiding the hammer. "It ain't about force. It's about rhythm, just like your music. Find the rhythm." She did. Tap, tap, thwack. The nail drove home, clean and true. She was proud of the blisters. She was proud of the sawdust in her hair. She was helping to build the walls that would protect them. When it came time to raise the main crossbeam, they could not do it alone. Eli had ridden out, hat in hand, and asked for help. Jedediah Stone had come, and Mr. Gable, and the two ranchers from the valley who had faced down the lawyer. They came, not for pay, but for neighborliness. Willa had cooked. She'd made a venison stew and 3 loaves of bread. The men worked, their shouts and grunts a new, vibrant sound. Eli was in the middle of them. Not the silent recluse, but the foreman, a man among men. By evening, the frame was up, stark and strong against the twilight sky. They sat on the porch, passing a bottle of whiskey, the men smoking, tired and content. Willa sat on the steps, nursing a cup of coffee. "She's a good barn, Eli. Mister," Gable said, wiping his mouth. "She'll stand for 100 years. Eli looked at the frame. Then he looked at Willa. "Aye," he said, his voice thick. "She will." It was a symbol, solid and real. They had torn down the rotten past and built a future, with their own hands, and with the help of the community that had once been his enemy. The letter came in late May. The mail rider brought it, and this time, Willa felt no fear. The envelope was from Boston, but the handwriting on the front was hers. It was the letter she had sent to her father's old lawyer, the one decent man she had known, inquiring about the legality of the Abernathy contract. She opened it. It was short. Mr. Abernathy, her lawyer wrote, had been indisposed. His financial empire, it seemed, was built on paper and fraud. He had been indicted on charges in New York, and his claims, including the one against her, were being dissolved by his creditors. The marriage contract, he wrote, was considered null and void. Mr. Abernathy had, in fact, fled the country. "You are free, Miss Morgan." He had addressed it to Miss Morgan. She smiled. He did not know. She was free, not because Eli had saved her, not because the town had protected her, but because the world had righted itself. The paper that had claimed to own her was now just paper. That night, she stood before the hearth. Eli was at the table, watching her. "It is over," she said. She held the letter, not the legal document, but the one that pronounced her freedom, and she held it to the fire. Eli did not ask what it was. He knew. She watched the paper curl, the black ink of her old life turning to gray ash and vanishing up the chimney. She had not needed this piece of paper. She had been free for months. But it was a ritual. It was the closing of the final door. She turned to him. The firelight played on her face. She was not the pale, terrified creature from the inn. Her skin was warmed by the sun. Her hands were strong. Her eyes were clear. "It is done," she said. He came to her and just held her, his arms wrapped around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. They stood in silence for a long time, just listening to the fire. Later, they lay in the dark. The barn was built. The threats were gone. The cabin was filled with a deep, profound peace. Spring air, smelling of pine and damp earth, drifted through the open window. Willa was nestled against his side, her head on his chest, her hand flat against his heart. She could feel the steady, slow beat of it. His body, solid and real, was a furnace against her. She sighed, a sound of pure contentment, and snuggled closer. "You're warm," she whispered. It was a simple, profound fact. He was life. He was safety. He was quiet for a moment. His hand came up, stroking her hair, his touch no longer hesitant, but sure and possessive. He answered, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "Because you're here." The summer settled on the valley, deep and green. The work was hard, but it was good work. They hayed the small field behind the new barn. They tended a garden that burst with beans and squash. Willa, with Mrs. Gable's help, learned to can, the shelves of the cabin filling with food for the next winter. But this winter would be different. They were ready for it. They were not prisoners. They were a family. Eli had spent 3 weeks of his evenings on a private task. He had taken the piano apart. He had cleaned every piece. He had used a catalog from Helena to order new strings and felt hammers. He had restrung the entire instrument, his rough, calloused hands working with a painstaking, focused tenderness. He had tuned it, using a fork he'd borrowed from the church, his ear surprisingly true. And then he had presented her with the bench. It was made of oak, sanded so smooth it felt like velvet, and oiled to a warm, deep brown. It was steady as the mountain itself. The story closes on a cool evening in late summer. The wind had picked up, a high, thin howl that swept down from the peaks. It was the sound that had once terrified her. Now, it was just the music of the wilderness. Inside the cabin, the lamp was lit. The room was warm. Willa sat at the piano, not the broken, sour instrument of the winter, but a restored one. She sat on the sturdy oak bench, her fingers, no longer pale, no longer soft, but strong and sure, moved over the keys. She was not playing Beethoven. She was not playing a hymn. She was playing a song of her own. It was a melody that was not sad and not angry. It was a song that sounded like the roaring creek and the steady thwack of an axe and the wide, quiet peace of the valley. It was a song of a hard-earned home. Eli sat in his chair by the fire. He was not staring into the flames, lost in ghosts. He was watching her, a small, soft smile on his face. He was whittling. In his hands, a small piece of pine was taking the shape of a hawk. Its wings spread, its head turned toward the music. They had been two broken people, trapped by a blizzard, their lives defined by what they had lost. Now, they were two whole people, bound not by the snow, but by a choice. Outside, the wind still howled across the vast, dark land, a reminder of the world's unforgiving nature. But inside the small log cabin, the music was clear and true. The fire was bright, and the bed was warm, filled with a love that had been, like the barn, rebuilt from the ground up and made to last. Thank you for listening to our story. We hope it brought a little warmth to your day. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from. Please drop a comment below and let us know. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories like this one. And finally, share your thoughts in English. What did you feel about Willa and Eli's journey? We read every one.